I'm Chris Bruce. I'm the director of the Museum of Art, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight. This is a sort of alternative sense of the time period that the exhibition in the gallery represents. The art and context 1950s and 60s is intentionally a group of works that represents kind of the high art, mainstream of the time. And so when we were doing this, we also wanted to begin to, cut through that kind of mainstream outline. And so Paul Bryans was one of the people we asked to speak. And funny thing is, he accepted our invitation to speak. So, and he's as most of you know, he's one of those. He's a very rare person in that he not only lived through the '60s, but he remembers it. And so we're sort of doubly blessed tonight, Paul received his PhD in literature from Indiana University in Bloomington in 1968, which was a very important time in terms of the beginning of the anti-war movement, or the beginnings of it. While he was there, he was editor of an alternative arts and politics tabloid called The Ballantonian, and covered the anti-war movement at that time. In that same year, in 1968, he came to WSU as an assistant professor of French and English, and has spent most of his career teaching classes in interdisciplinary intellectual and cultural history. He was one of the first teachers in the World Civilizations course, covering the period before 1500. So he brings a perspective to 1960s that's a little bit different than mine, anyway, because I just lived through it, but I can't remember it. His books include Bawdy Tales from the Courts of Medieval France, Nuclear Holocaust, Atomic War in Fiction, 1895 to 1984, Common Errors in English Usage, and a Modern South Asian Literature in English. He's a major contributor to the online World Civilizations image repository in WSU's library, Division of Manuscripts, Archives, and Special Collections, and his photography has been used in many places, notably in a forthcoming National Geographic television documentary. The library also owns his comprehensive collection of underground comics and other ephemera from the 60s. So, and finally, he received the Burlington Northern Award for Excellence in Teaching in 1992, and probably should have gotten it last year also, right? They probably don't give it more than once.
Right.
That's why there's not a whole lineup. Anyway, he's now Director of Undergraduate Studies in English, and so without further ado, please welcome Paul Bryans.
Good evening. I've got a couple of microphones on. Are they working? Yeah? Okay, good. Thumbs up there. All right, I'm going to be reading from a text. This will take just about an hour, and then I'll be happy to take questions.
I forgot to warn you.
Okay, yes. A little warning. When you come to a talk on the 60s, you got to expect that you might get offended. If you were at a talk about the 60s and you didn't get offended by anything, then it wasn't really about the 60s. So there are all kinds of ways that people may be offended with this talk, so just be aware. All right. Over the years, I've often been interviewed about what WSU was like in the 1960s, usually by reporters incredulous that anything significant could have happened in Pullman. Things did indeed happen here, however, and they deserve a fuller recounting than they received so far. This will not be a systematic history of the period. The best source for that sort of thing is William L. Stimson's Going to Washington State. I'm going to tell some stories from the student point of view and barrage you with images of what it was like to be young and politically active at WSU between 1968 and 1970. Because this talk is part of a series on the art of the period, I'll begin with some background on counterculture iconography. There was not one counterculture, of course, but many, sometimes in conflict, sometimes interwoven, constantly changing. The art of the 60s now in the museum is from a different 60s than the imagery I'm going to explore tonight, literally. What is known as the 60s counterculture flourished between roughly 1966 and 1972, whereas the pop art and minimalist movements had gotten started much earlier and had very little resonance with hippies and protesters. There were indeed artists, mostly on the West Coast, working in a vein much more closely akin to the counterculture, including our own Pat Seiler, but that's not my subject tonight. Instead, I want to focus on the counterculture itself and how it affected WSU. The result will be a glimpse of activism in the 60s from my own personal point of view, focusing on images, their power, and their limitations. Most pop art drew directly on contemporary mass culture imagery, enhancing its very banality, as in Andy Warhol's famous Campbell soup cans. This style entranced the art gallery crowd, but had very little appeal for young people in the streets. Warhol did have his own house rock band, of course, the Velvet Underground, and designed a famous album cover for them. Warhol created an even more phallic-themed jacket for the Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers album, complete with a working zipper. Roy Lichtenstein drew on comics for their banality, their absurd sentimentality, and their crudity. By isolating single frames, he made their weakness obvious and turned them into caricatures of themselves. The color experiments of Victor Vasarely's op art had a certain influence on later rock poster art, in which the color contrasts were pushed to much greater extremes. Now, most rock poster and cover art was far removed in style from the dominant schools of the New York gallery scene. It rejected minimalism for maximalism, jamming images together. It rejected contemporary graphic styles for nostalgic references back to earlier periods. And instead of the cool distancing of much 60s gallery art, aimed to ram directly into the viewer's nervous system with maximum sensory and emotional impact. One of the unfashionable art styles exerting a strong influence on rock art was surrealism. Collage, drawing on antique sources, incongruous juxtaposition of separate elements, visual puns, all these traditional surrealistic techniques are present in the cover for Moby Grape's album, Wow. Although Israeli-born artist Mati Klarvein's Annunciation was created in 1961, it was not until 1970 that it became a cultural icon when it was used for the cover of the Santana album, Abraxas. A flaming nude angel announces the miraculous birth to come of a similarly nude Black Madonna, and the dove, symbolizing the Holy Spirit, which traditionally hovers above her, is placed directly in front of her genitals, implying that whereas the biblical Annunciation story involved a purely spiritual meeting between the divine and human realms, in this case, the union is going to be physical, sexual. Klarvein's transformation of traditional imagery and interest in black figures is also reflected in his later album covers for the Electric Band of Miles Davis. The model for the central figure here was Klarvein's girlfriend from Guadalupe. This sort of sexualizing of religious imagery is a hallmark of the Surrealist tradition. In graduate school, I'd taken a course on French Surrealism, and my first published academic scholarly work was a review of new books on Surrealism. It was logical that one of my early talks to the English department in Pullman compared the psychedelic aesthetic with Surrealism. A truly classic, whoops, I got a missing image. Okay, I'm going to skip that. The Art Nouveau. The Art Nouveau style, known in Austria as the Secession movement, exerted an enormous influence over the artists who created the San Francisco rock posters. This blocky, difficult-to-read typeface was designed by Alfred Roller, here shown in a poster for a 1903 exhibit of secessionist art. Roller's typeface is fitted into curving shapes in this Captain Beefheart poster by Wes Wilson from 1966. This Wilson poster for the Blues Project reduces the lettering almost entirely to a graphic element, making the poster more like a mandala for meditation than an informative advertisement. That's the information down at the bottom there. Can you read it? Bonnie McLean, the only woman among the pioneer poster artists, worked in the same Art Nouveau style. One of Alfred Mucha's most famous advertising posters became transformed by Mouse Studios into a context where the figure smoke probably contained something other than tobacco. Sometimes the influence of earlier art is very direct, as in this cover where the main image was simply borrowed from an old woman's magazine cover. The poster artist specialized in combining colors that vibrated wildly against each other, violating every rule of traditional design. Notice in this Victor Moscoso work, you have to keep switching between viewing a particular color as background or figure in order to decipher the lettering. Rick Griffin developed his own illegible typography and mystical iconography. His work looks distinctive, but still clearly reflected Art Nouveau influences in places. Look at the upper right-hand border of the right-hand one. This is the one that I meant to show earlier. This is a very surrealistic cover by Mothers of Invention, juxtaposing two really disparate kinds of images. Underground comics. Another countercultural phenomenon which began in the late 1960s were the underground comics, always spelled with an X, by the way, published by small independent companies, almost always in black and white, and featuring lots of sex, drugs, over-the-top violence, and general outrageousness. Styles ranged all over, but it was quite common to see a look recalling the comics of the 30s and 40s. These comics were sold primarily in head shops, though I first encountered them in my hometown's Greyhound Depot's magazine rack in 1967 when I began building the collection now housed in the WSU Library's Division of Manuscripts, Archives, and Special Collections. By the way, that collection is a little hard to use now because it's not completely cataloged, but they're working on it. Contrast Lichtenstein's approach to the romance comics we saw earlier with this cover of Snarf, featuring 40s-style funny animals and the Venus de Milo. Underground comic artists were mostly apolitical, more engaged in general cultural criticism than specific causes, but this title mocks Cold War paranoia in its title, Commies from Mars, the Red Planet. Political satire, when it appeared, was often crassly sexual, as in this variation on the memorable final scene of Dr. Strangelove, in which Slim Pickens straddled the missile which would trigger Armageddon. The audiences for underground comics and radical political publications rarely overlapped. So it stunned a lot of members of Students for a Democratic Society when in 1969 they found that a special issue of their usually grimly serious journal, Radical America, had been turned into an underground comic book featuring a cover cartoon of famed segregationalist Lester Maddox. It alludes to an incident in which he attacked with an axe handle an attempted pro-integration sit-in at his fried chicken restaurant. So vengeance is coming via an invading alien monster chicken. One unusual underground artist was Guy Colwell, who celebrated interracial sex and rock and roll in his inner-city romance comics. Most readers assumed he must be black, but he was in fact a white guy. Unlike the pop artists, R. Crumb disdained 50s comic styles and drew instead on the bulging, jazzy forms of the 1930s in much of his work. Every city and college town of any size had an alternative paper or two, but the most famous of them all was the San Francisco Oracle, which specialized in a layout heavily influenced by psychedelic mysticism. The publisher got rich sending hippies out on the street to sell copies to straight tourists in the Haight-Ashbury, but he later absconded with the profits, putting an end to the Oracle's short but lively history. Whole pages were given over to elaborate collages featuring iconic figures like Alice in Wonderland and the Buddha. The first alternative paper in Pullman was Scorn, which featured in its first issue an eloquent column advocating the study of black history, accompanied by a striking borrowed graphic. WSU SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, issued a number of mimeograph position papers, but they lacked a regular publication. Radical Union, which succeeded it, initially put out a cheaply reproduced sheet called Spark after the revolutionary Russian paper founded by Lenin, in Russian Iskra. The cover story deals with the then ongoing trial of Bobby Seale, the only black member of the Chicago Seven, whose courtroom outbursts were dealt with by shackling him to his chair and gagging him in a way that reminded a lot of viewers of the days of slavery. From '69 on, white radicals responded to minority criticisms that theirs was a white movement by focusing prominently and forcefully on issues of race. The well-organized and highly visible Trotskyite Socialist Workers' Party made a special point of it, referring in this fall 1969 poster to both racism generally and racist murders in particular. Spark was followed by the Three Forks Press and Burgerville Blues, both of which will be touched on later. The term counterculture had real meaning in the 60s, when television, Hollywood, and the press steadfastly ignored most manifestations of the emerging youth culture. In response, young people developed their own organizations, customs, newspapers, magazines, their own comic books, poster art, their own music, signs, and symbols. Prominent among these were the peace sign and the peace symbol, now frequently confused with each other. Let us begin with the peace sign. During World War II, British Premier Winston Churchill popularized the V for victory sign, which had immense resonance for people of that generation. This generally came to be seen as a cheerful, upbeat sign and was adopted by the hippies as an expression of goodwill and, ironically, of peace. This photo is of the famous Death of Hippie March in the Haight in late 1967. It seems a fitting symbol of the gesture's fragility. It almost immediately became a joke and was abandoned by all except commercial artists and little kids who loved flashing it at anybody with long hair who might return the gesture. Gilbert Shelton's fabulous Furry Freak Brothers demonstrate the three most common hand gestures of the period, all of which played a role at WSU. The nascent Christian right adopted the annoying one-way hand symbol, emphasizing that only faith in Jesus could solve our problems. And a few of us, fed up with their smugness, formed a group to argue that religion produced more problems than solutions, and funded our activities by selling these extremely popular counter buttons reading, "No way." Much more popular among political activists and longer lasting was the peace symbol. It was designed in 1958 by artist Gerald Holtham as the symbol of the British campaign for nuclear disarmament. He combined the semaphore signal for the letter N for nuclear with the signal for the letter D for disarmament. Lay them on top of each other, draw a circle around them, and you have the peace symbol. Most often seen on buttons, the peace symbol was also worn on armbands during demonstrations. Here are a couple of examples from WSU. From the beginning, there have always been people who confuse the peace symbol with the Mercedes-Benz symbol, omitting the bottom vertical stroke. If you're trying to be cool and 60-ish, just don't make that mistake. It's embarrassing. Incorporated into the design of the American flag, it became the peace flag, a symbol of what protesters felt the country should stand for. Protesters sometimes also carried the official U.S. flag into their demonstrations, refusing to surrender the national symbol to their opponents. Here, the two flags are carried side by side in a 1968 Vietnam moratorium protest march to downtown Pullman. Notice the drummer also is meant to recall a 76 kind of image. The logo of the Three Forks Press, the radical union newspaper published at WSU, consisted of a peace sign formed out of three forks over stars and stripes. In pioneer days, one name for this area was Three Forks, referring to the three forks of the river that merged here, so that became an alternative name for Pullman. Young Americans for Freedom, a student pro-government group, reworked the symbol as a circle around a B-52 bomber with the slogan, "Peace through victory." Although the peace sign was short-lived, it was soon succeeded among activists by the raised fist salute. It harked back to an old leftist tradition, still very alive in Europe at the time, in which the clenched fist, hoisted aloft, symbolized defiance of authority, the union of individuals, represented by the clenched fingers, to create unity and strength. Intended to inspire the masses, it also annoyed many who were not so committed and did not appreciate having clenched fists shoved in their faces at every turn. You can see the transition in this photograph from a spring 1972 march down Main Street. The guy on the right is flashing the old peace sign, while the one in the center is waving his fist. This stencil pattern was everywhere on campus in the spring of 1970. The raised fist made its greatest impact in the U.S. at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico, when two black medal winners defiantly raised their fists during the playing of the national anthem in what was referred to as the Black Power Salute. This caused a huge uproar. When black students and some white supporters made the same gesture before a WSU basketball game, the reaction was less widespread, of course, but equally vehement. When I arrived in Pullman, August 1968, the only sign of a counterculture was a languishing little poster and incense shop on the ground floor of the soon-to-be-demolished Pullman Hotel. It was replaced by the Second Flight Gallery, housed in what is now the Swilley's building, as it liked to boast, across the street from the police station. I didn't know it at the time, but I had come to work at the alma mater of one of the founding fathers of the psychedelic counterculture. Timothy Leary received his MA in psychology here in 1947. Somehow that fact never gets mentioned in WSU recruiting materials. I was a new minted PhD, just 26, closer in age and interest to the students than to most of my fellow faculty members. The first anti-war march I took part in after moving here was on a drizzly day in Spokane. That's me on the left. Allen Ginsberg came through Pullman in April of 1969, chanting and reciting his often politically inflected poetry to great effect. So when I was invited that year to take part in a debate at the University of Idaho over the proposal for an anti-ballistic missile force, I wrote a poem based on a good deal of research called ABM-ABC, and recited it sitting cross-legged atop the symposium table in my brightest shirt with my long hair hanging down. It created quite a sensation, for at that time the U of I was even more conservative than WSU. I've been told there's a picture of that, but I've never found it. Plenty of celebrities came to campus, often leading figures for various contemporary causes, like Dick Gregory, who had by then abandoned comedy for politics. Hair was a big deal in the 60s, the most visible sign of rebellion. Several students told me that when they went home for Thanksgiving, their parents refused to let them in the house until they cut their hair. It is astonishing how much venom and passion were expended on the battle between short-haired conservatives and the long hairs. To represent the look of students around 1969 on campus, this photo of student government officials will do. Notice not only how clean-cut they are, but how the women are draped ornamentally over the men. All of that would change shortly with the rise of women's liberation. The black student in the back row is Carlton Lewis, who is to play an important role as student president for 2 terms, starting in the spring of 1970, here sporting a larger afro. Lewis was a charming, intelligent young man, a natural-born leader, and very highly regarded among students and faculty alike. The next year, students were considerably shaggier. This photo of the ASWSU program board still features one lap-sitting young woman, but note that she's been joined by 2 lap-sitting young men. The guy in the center is Gary Larson, later to become famous as creator of the Far Side cartoon. This is me in 1970.
Full disclosure.
There were long hairs and long hairs. At first, radicals disdained hippies and wouldn't be caught dead in tie-dye and love beads. This Pullman couple created a highly successful business in making candles and selling them on the street, here in front of the Common Ministry next to the bookie. Anti-capitalist true believers scorned such hip entrepreneurship in cartoons like this one, which appeared in a campus radical newspaper. The preferred dress of the truly committed was jeans topped by an army fatigue jacket. Some of the guys earned their fatigues the traditional way by doing a tour of duty in the military, but most bought them from the then very common army surplus stores. I can't see where the guy with the bullhorn in this WSU demonstration got his, but he has the look down perfectly. This distinction began to break down, partly under the dissolving power of music and drugs. I remember vividly my astonishment the first time I saw an SDS leader wearing love beads with his army jacket. The fact that he was a vet, and though he had not seen combat, made it all the more striking. The various strands of youth subculture never blended into a single mass, but they did intertwine in all sorts of interesting ways. Starting in San Francisco and spreading across the country, students began creating alternative educational institutions, offering classes in radical or unusual subjects not on the official college curriculum. Most of them were called free universities. As we had to explain repeatedly, the word free in the name referred to freedom, not to lack of cost. The one we founded at WSU in 1969 charged $1 per course, later raised to $3. I was one of 5 founders, and after my student comrades graduated, became the coordinator of what eventually became known as the Community Free University for 30 years. After printing one initial article about our founding, the Evergreen steadfastly refused to print any of our publicity. So if you want to read about our history, you'll have to consult my website. Just type Community Free University into Google. The teachers were unpaid volunteers, and the money was used exclusively for printing brochures and buying advertisements. We experimented with several catalog designs before settling on this drawing WSU graphics artist Ulrich Fern did for us. But I found the Palouse brain image particularly memorable. A unique feature of Pullman was the Faculty Motorcycle Club, which bore the proudly swaggering name, the Up Against the Wall Motherfucker Motorcycle Club. They were usually referred to as the Mothers. To join, you needed a serious hog and a PhD. They mostly just rode around for fun on weekends, sporting their leathers featuring a modified peace logo on a shield. One of the moving spirits behind the Mothers was Jerry Lilje, an extraordinary philosophy professor who for a time owned a lively bar in Palouse. Here's Jerry hanging out with the leaders of the Black Student Union at a radical union party in Rainey Park, raising funds for black student defendants. This spread of photos that comes from shows several views of the event, including in the upper right, the ever-present plainclothes cops. Once a year, the Mothers held a lively dance as a benefit for some radical cause like the Panthers' free breakfast program. In the lower right-hand corner of this poster is the United Farm Workers logo. Macho swagger and boisterous humor were so mixed in the Mothers' brand of radicalism that it was hard to know from outside how seriously they took themselves. But when they invited people to a, quote, gang rape and bludgeoning at the Unitarian Church, even those of us who were appalled at their language knew enough not to take them literally. These remarkable posters were all designed by artist Bill Voiland and printed in the sort of vibrant colors that had been popularized by the San Francisco poster artists. These posters feature the logo of the Mothers, a modified peace symbol inscribed with a motto in Swahili, which loosely translated means beware of the pigs, or look out for the cops. They were too cool to call themselves after Pullman, so of course their shield also bears the place name Three Forks. When a more traditional band of outlaw bikers decided to challenge them, the Mothers hastily disbanded. In the end, despite all their macho swagger, the Mothers proved to be like Planet Earth in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, mostly harmless. The Mothers had no monopoly on left-wing partying. In reaction to the annual ROTC military ball, the radicals on campus held an anti-military ball for a couple of years. One of the first things I got involved in politically in Pullman was a draft counseling service in the Koinonia House run by the Common Ministry. The K House was home to all kinds of activism in those days and ran a popular coffee house in the basement with the walls papered with underground publications. A lot of SDS members scorned draft counseling, viewing it as a cop-out for prosperous white students to evade the draft at the expense of poor people of color. They preferred to advocate resistance in jail or exile in Canada. Despite the fact that I agreed draft counseling was far from perfect, I still felt that young men should not be forced to fight in a war they opposed, and spent a lot of time and energy helping many of them find alternatives, with a fair amount of success. I wrote this draft column for Scorn, and later did a regular column in the Evergreen. The San Francisco Mime Troupe, despite its name, specialized in short satirical plays on political subjects, with little miming involved. They appeared on campus in 1968 and inspired local radicals to put on political sketches of their own from time to time. The sketches we staged were fairly crude and propagandistic, but they attracted an audience better than the usual political harangue. Pullman didn't have a Woodstock, but it did manage a Polstock, whose publicity did a clever variation on the better-known rock festival's logo. A large house on A Street housed the Rosa Luxemburg Collective, through which a lively cast of activists, freaks, and others constantly rotated, but where many of the ideas of the movement in Pullman were hatched and created, often in the large kitchen in the center of the house, with its back wall covered with a huge portrait of the German socialist intellectual Rosa Luxemburg. I've never found a picture of that painting, by the way. If anybody has one, I'd love to have it. A lot of silkscreen posters were created at Rosa's, including this one featuring a radical quotation from Abraham Lincoln. This country with its institutions belongs to the people who inhabit it. Whenever they shall grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it or their revolutionary right to dismember or overthrow it. Two of the most important and creative inhabitants of Rosa's, as it was called, were David Mathiasen and Molly Martin, both journalism students who worked on the Evergreen. But they put far more of their energies into SDS, Radical Union, Women's Liberation, and other organizations and causes. Molly went on to a career as an electrician and electrical inspector and wrote a remarkable book about women in the building trades. They were both brilliant, energetic, fearless, and had great senses of humor and a low tolerance for dogmatism. Although the anti-war movement is generally considered an affair of youth, people of all different ages marched with us, and several of the most important local leaders were graduate students, like PhD candidates Jerry Calvert and Vic Stevens. Vic was president of SDS when I first got here, and his wife succeeded him the next year. The movement was not just an upsurge of adolescent hormones. There's been no end of analysis purporting to explain why the baby boomers erupted in revolt as they entered young adulthood, but it's worth focusing on the short-term influences that led to the events of 1968 and 69. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, dashing the hopes of many young idealists. This catastrophe was followed by the eruption of a massive wave of violence in the cities, which now seems like a close parallel to the lethal riots that erupted in 1947 upon the assassination of one of his models, Mahatma Gandhi. The presidential campaigns of Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy inspired a lot of young people and gave them hope that the war might be ended through the electoral process. But Kennedy was assassinated, and the Democratic establishment cracked down hard on the peace faction at the 1968 convention in Chicago, nominating instead Lyndon Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey. To the older generation, Humphrey was the happy warrior, the great defender of liberal causes, including civil rights. To the younger generation, he was a perfect example of the liberal sellout, having joined in support of the mad crusade of Johnson in Vietnam. The cover cartoon from this early underground comic publication conveys crudely but vividly many young people's attitudes toward Humphrey. It's Johnson on the toilet with Humphrey being the toilet. Brain transfer. The Vietnam War was intensely unpopular with many young people for many reasons. One, it was built on lies. Two, it constituted an illegal intervention in what was essentially a civil war, mistakenly hoping to keep enemies from our own shores. Three, we had allied ourselves with unreliable and corrupt leaders. Four, the principal victims were innocent civilians, mostly women and children. And five, no amount of resources poured into the effort or lives lost seemed to move us an inch out of a seemingly endless quagmire. Sound familiar? The campaign year, after a highly successful initial beginning for anti-war forces, turned into a huge disappointment, with no alternative for those who wished to vote for peace. That fall, SDS staged an anti-election protest on the west side of Holland, hanging the candidates in effigy. I didn't much like the effigy business, but I went ahead with the talk I'd been asked to give. I was regretting that I had earlier sent an absentee ballot to Indiana, where I was still registered, voting for the Humphrey ticket. And I and other faculty members urged voters to sit this one out. Some analysts like to blame people like us for Nixon's election. but it's clear that we had very little effect on the outcome, and I still blame the Democrats for not having given us an alternative. How could we know that this was the period of moderation? 2.5 years later, when Nixon was again hanged in effigy on the campus, he was also burned. In the account that follows, I'm going to use the term proudly claimed by African Americans in the 60s, black, because to do otherwise would be to distort history. There were about 150 black students at WSU in 1968, and they were often viewed as outsiders by the rather insular white students. Grad students conducted a survey which estimated that there were 5 to 10 self-confessed white bigots among the students for every black student. There were several clashes with racial overtones, the earliest significant one that year being a heated argument at a basketball game which led to 4 armed black athletes invading a fraternity house and firing some shots at the walls. Arrested and convicted of assault, the black students called on their allies in SDS and elsewhere to Colfax, where they were supposed to put themselves in for the first of a series of weekends, according to a sentence which allowed them to continue their studies during the week. Rather confused about the point of this exercise, I went along and witnessed the amazing sight of dozens of white and black students surrounding the 4, insisting that the sheriff jail all of them or none of them. They were housed in a church overnight and fed at public expense, and 45 people peacefully submitted to arrest the next morning and were given light fines. This episode was to prove characteristic in several ways of Pullman during this era. The issue involved race. It was dealt with interracially. The protesters were nonviolent, and the authorities acted with great restraint. In the right rear of this portrait of the officers of the Black Student Union, Union President Ernie Thomas wears the sort of black leather jacket associated with Black Panthers and those who emulated them. Thomas later earned his PhD and is now president of a community college in Texas. A distinctive feature of the black movement of this period was the use of African art, clothing styles, and imagery, as illustrated here by the poster of an African mask hanging in the office of Black Studies Director Talmadge Anderson. The most visible radical black force at the time was the Black Panther Party, originating in Oakland, California, and spreading to several cities. Angry, loud, and armed, they thrust themselves on the national consciousness in a big way, and a major campaign was waged by them to free from prison founder Huey Newton, who had been accused of killing a police officer in a gunfight. This poster was displayed in a lot of dorm rooms during the period. Although the Panthers, getting ahead of myself, although the Panthers had the support of only a minority of blacks in the country, they profoundly impressed more people than actually agreed with them. Their fearless defiance became a model for many others, black and white. What was less clear at the time was that the Panthers were heavily influenced by white radical organizations like SDS. SDS and the Panthers engaged in an elaborate dance of one-upsmanship and emulation during their heyday. The strongest faculty ally and advisor of the black students at WSU was the brilliant Janetta Cole in anthropology, who might have appeared outspokenly radical to the administration, but actually exercised a moderating influence at many points, making BSU protests much more effective than they might have been. She went on to distinguish herself as president of Spelman College. Not long after the Black Student Union became highly visible, MeChA was formed by Chicanos on campus. Mexican-American immigrants and their offspring had long used the term Chicano to label themselves, and the term gained widespread usage during this period, especially in the struggle to organize migrant laborers in the grape and lettuce fields of California by the United Farm Workers. Founder and leader Cesar Chavez didn't make it to campus, but Dolores Huerta, his distinguished co-founder and organizer, did. In this photo, you can see, around her neck, the symbol of the UFW, the Aztec eagle, borrowed from the Mexican flag. This banner, featuring the UFW symbol, was hung in the entrance to the Cub during the student campaign against non-union lettuce being served there. The leader and spokesperson of MeChA was another remarkable woman, Margarita Mendoza de Sugiyama. The only photograph I could find of her is this recent one. The daughter of migrant workers herself, she was passionately devoted to the cause of the UFW and was the leading force behind the various student initiatives to support them. She's gone on to have a distinguished governmental career working on civil rights issues and has often returned to WSU to lead racism workshops and speak on related issues. Note the consistent pattern. Student leaders at WSU were often women. After months of boycotting grapes and pressuring local grocery stores to stock union grapes, many of us were growing exasperated. This was the background to an event that got huge publicity around the state, the Great Grape Stomp. It actually began with a planned demonstration at the Selective Service Office in downtown Pullman. The draft board knew we were coming, and we arrived to find the office locked and deserted. Having a large band of activists on hand, Margarita, who was marching with us, suggested we take our protest instead to the local grocery stores in support of the farm workers' boycott. Nothing illustrates better how intimately intertwined various causes were in this period. Unfortunately, when we arrived at Safeway on Grand Avenue, where UPS is located now, some hotheads decided to go inside, grab non-union grapes, and trample them in the parking lot. As a crime against property, it was pretty absurd, but I knew right away it would mean trouble. The same routine was repeated at the other two grocery stores at the north end of town. Although the damage amounted to a few bucks, it caused a huge row. This is not the place to detail the events surrounding the catastrophic August 1969 convention of SDS, which ultimately led to the dissolution of this organization. That story has often been told in print, but I'd like to share a few of my own views and experiences. I was one of a group of delegates who drove from WSU to Chicago in a battered old car to represent our local chapter at the national meeting. We had a difficult time sorting through the forces that clashed with each other as various groups broke off in independent caucuses. If you look really close, you can see there are 3 separate caucuses meeting different parts of the hall here, everybody disagreeing with each other. Women often complained about the male dominance of the movement, but there were plenty of outspoken young women like this one. The main groups in conflict with each other were the highly disciplined, Maoist-inspired Progressive Labor Party faction and the national leadership, Maoist in a different way, calling itself the Revolutionary Youth Movement, one faction of which was to shortly develop into the famed underground terrorist group known at first as the Weathermen, and later, in gender-neutral language, as the Weather Underground, after a famous line from a Bob Dylan song, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." I always thought that was kind of suggestive. We really didn't need the weatherman, you know. This poster was a weatherman propaganda in form of the photographs superimposed on the North Vietnamese flag. In the chaos of denunciations, clashing demonstrations, and walkouts, the only people that seemed to be making sense to me were the anarchists, and this marked the beginning of my gradual disillusionment with the Marxist left and interest in other kinds of American radical traditions. Students for a Democratic Society had succeeded because it lived up to its name of being extremely democratic. Initiatives usually came at the local level, with the national officers acting as little more than coordinators. For me, the low point of the convention came when the national officers brought onto the stage a row of armed, fierce-looking Black Panthers to stare down those who were objecting to their attempts to expel PLP and steer SDS in their own direction. Not that this act was wholly opportunistic. The Weathermen emphasized the battle against white-skin privilege and frequently featured Panther-style imagery in their calls for immediate revolution. Their dominant slogan became "Bring the War Home," open alliance with the cause of the Vietnamese Liberation Front through acts of armed insurrection and sabotage. The Weathermen permanently alienated a lot of us when they glorified a kid who had derailed a passenger train with a hunk of concrete as an exemplary revolutionary. Though they saw themselves as the revolutionary vanguard, most of us felt they were deluded thugs, doing tremendous damage to the movement and destroying SDS in the process. After the convention, most SDS chapters, including ours, dissolved in disgust, often setting up new organizations under the general umbrella label of Radical Union, which had no centralized leadership. RU leader Jerry Calvert indignantly marked up his copy of the Weatherman publication, which featured a photo of revolutionary cadre preparing to take on the Chicago police force, scrawling across the top of this puerile manifesto, "Read this shit." Robert Crumb satirized this sort of bravado in the cover for Motor City Comics, which reflects less support for revolutionary violence than it does Crumb's well-known fetish for women with large muscled legs. The Weathermen announced a Days of Rage action in Chicago in which a few hundred radicals clashed with the Chicago police, with the unsurprising result that the students were thoroughly pounded and arrested, including at least one WSU student I knew personally, a young woman who probably didn't weigh 98 pounds, but who was arrested for assaulting a cop with her bare hands. In Pullman, In Pullman, RU was their leading political voice from the fall of '69 to May of 1970, which is an astonishingly short period when I look back on it now, but which seemed then like a whole era and a very tumultuous one. One of the products of RU was the nicely produced tabloid Burgerville Blues. On the western edge of Pullman, on the road leading into town, there used to be a popular drive-in called Burgerville. The probably apocryphal story was that a truck driver arrived in Moscow, puzzled as to why he had missed Pullman, his destination. When somebody explained to him that he would have to have passed through it on his way from Spokane, he's supposed to have said, "I never saw Pullman, but I passed through some place called Burgerville." So Burgerville became a joking name for Pullman. I love the graphic on the cover of this issue featuring a jokey salute to Chairman Mao. Tongue-in-cheek humor was a hallmark of a lot of radical union activity. Earlier publications had been constantly subject to being shut down as various print shops refused to work with them. The old saying that freedom of the press belongs to those who own one is very true. Burgerville Blues benefited from being produced on a small press which its publishers had bought and hauled to Pullman from Portland. Unfortunately, a group of Seattle activists with a more radical than thou attitude decided the revolution wasn't going to happen in Pullman and appropriated the press for their own purposes, using firearms to back up their arguments. The Pullman crowd debated defending the press forcefully, but ultimately decided it wasn't a cause worth dying for. In the midst of the turmoil on the WSU campus in the spring of '69, the Evergreen took the time to salute with this photo a hallowed legend commemorated with the traditional rhyme, "Hooray, hooray for the 8th of May, outdoor intercourse starts today." The result was a stern rebuke from the publications board. ROTC had been the target of many protests over the years, with some faculty arguing that their courses did not deserve academic credit and many students finding them offensive during a period when they were generating large numbers of officers to lead the troops in Vietnam. The story of the protests at the May 1970 annual ROTC review has been told only in fragments, so I will try to piece together the elements that were to lead to one of the strongest visual images of the period, though it's difficult to illustrate because it involved an advertised act that never took place, and it culminated in one that was not photographed. So there's not going to be any new pictures for a while. There's just this one photograph to illustrate this segment. Radical Union scheduled a political theater performance for the Cub Auditorium the day of the review during the lunch hour. The Cub was packed, and we considered the event quite a success. The idea was to invite the audience to proceed with us down to the football field to protest at the ROTC ceremony about to take place, where graduates would be honored by various officials, including President Terrell. But when we emerged from the Cub, we encountered an enormous crowd expecting a very different event. Pranksters had posted signs on the mall announcing a noontime bra burning by the Women's Liberation Organization. And thousands of students had shown up to witness it. People had climbed on the rooftops of surrounding buildings for a better view. This was a much more massive crowd than RU had ever been able to inspire. Here, let me insert a little background on bra burning. The image of the bra-burning feminist is one of the most durable urban legends of modern times. It originated at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, September 7th, 1968, when a group of women showed up with protest signs in a barrel, which they called the Freedom Trash Can, and into which they tossed various items constraining women, such as makeup, high-heeled shoes, women's magazines, and, yes, bras. Nothing was burned, but the legend of the bra burning had been born and shows no sign of dying 4 decades later. It was a stereotype of the time that feminists were supposed to be man-hating, sexless harridans, and the incongruous but titillating image of such activists sporting the no-bra look, so common among hip young women of the time, burned itself into the public imagination, and ever afterwards, feminists have found themselves having to explain that they have never advocated the burning of brassieres. So it was not surprising that on that day in May 1970, when pranksters posted signs announcing that women's liberation would burn their bras on the mall at noon, more than 2,500 students turned out to witness the spectacle. Chants went up of, "We want bras," but the only response was one man who flourished a bra and burned it, and a few other men who burned their shorts. During this latter event, one young man brandished an athletic supporter and shouted, "This is to show my support." It was this fired up, disappointed, but not particularly political mob that the radical union members encountered when they emerged from the Cub. I was encouraged to seize the occasion to invite the crowd to join our march down to the football field, and many of them did. The authorities were prepared for us, and we had set aside an area out of sight from the main reviewing stand into which we were herded to picket and chant to our heart's content while the ceremony went on. Suddenly, 4 women, robed in black witches' costumes and with faces painted red and blue, ran onto the field, carrying a sheet by its 4 corners, which they dumped in front of a group of graduating cadets facing President Terrell and various ROTC officers. Piled on the sheet was a heap of what appeared to be bloody guts. In fact, it consisted of assorted animal organs from a local butcher shop, liberally sprinkled with ketchup. The effect was stunning. Without a word, they had transposed the context of the ceremony from one of abstract patriotism to bloody death. My first thought was, wow, how amazing. And my second thought was, am I going to be arrested for inciting this? A not very heroic, but I hope understandable reaction, which was increased when moments later emboldened protesters began to leap the barricades and run out onto the field during the final review of cadets marching past the officials. Groups of protesters interspersed themselves within the parade, chanting slogans, taunting the cadets, and some began giving the Nazi salute to Terrell and the officers as well. Even at the time, this bothered me intensely. Treating every political opponent as another Hitler is an appallingly simplistic and offensive feature of American political life. Now that I know President Terrell was among those who landed at Normandy on D-Day to fight Hitler, I'm amazed that he did not respond more angrily than he did. Note the dog in the foreground of this photograph, which began nosing around the discarded animal guts, creating a macabre effect. I was down on the field too, but I was not happy with the way the demonstration was turning out, with individuals being attacked rather than institutions and policies. To my way of thinking, this demonstration combined the most brilliant wit and the most deplorable witlessness of the anti-war movement, and illustrated clearly how impossible it was to control both events and images once they got underway. The real women's liberation movement was founded at WSU in a couple of groups led by female members of SDS. The most prominent was the Liberation Front, which took a typically radical-sounding name, but engaged in a lot of very intensive study and public education, like these spokeswomen for WLF, one of whom I was married to at the time. Women's liberation activists generally regarded the National Organization for Women as too conservative for their liking, and instead of the rather stodgy NOW logo, devised their own variation on the clenched fist theme. At that time, men's social groups often had women's auxiliaries who provided feminine support by conducting bake sales and such. And I thought it would be fun and a consciousness raiser to form a men's auxiliary of the Women's Liberation Front for the sole purpose of selling male-produced baked goodies once a year to fund their activities. These bake sales, held in front of the Koinonia House, were highly successful. After the 60s movement died away, I found myself drawn back to feminism as one of the most successful, lasting radical movements around, and served for several years as the secretary of the local NOW chapter. Students agitated to ban the CIA and Marines from recruiting on the WSU campus with no success. RU finally assembled a crowd for an anti-war skit and then urged them to mill around inside the placement center in the old administration annex where Marine recruiters were being hosted on campus. The director of the center tried to block the entrance, but the protesters shoved past. In the center of this photograph of the building occupation is one of the most important couples of the period, anthropology professors Janetta and Bob Cole. 2 of the students wound up being charged with assault for this shoving incident. The one on the left was Don Smith. Don was a generally quiet, thoughtful fellow, but he had strong feelings about the war. Here he has a starring role in the RU skit performed on the mall just before the demonstration which led to his arrest. During the later Cambodian bombing sit-in in Stadium Way, whoops, my picture's missing. When a driver threatened to roll right over the students, Don grabbed a 2x4 from a barricade and slammed it through the car window. This resulted in another arrest. He was called up by the draft and decided to enter the Army as a radical organizer and provided himself with a bundle of the protest paper published for soldiers, the bond. Let me skip ahead and see. Yeah, there's the sit-in, and there's the bond. But the Army rejected him. Flat feet, they said. I've always doubted it was his feet they were worried about. The other student in that photograph with Don was Joe Schock. Joe had voluntarily joined the Marines and gone to fight in Vietnam. But the experience embittered and enraged him, and he came out of the military ready to do what he could to stop the war. Whereas Don got in trouble only when he felt force was being used against him, Joe was less introspective and a lot more impulsive. On his own, he rode his motorcycle down to Lewiston on May 5, 1970, to the National Guard Armory, splashed gasoline liberally around the motor pool, and burned up a lot of expensive military vehicles. Unfortunately for him, he couldn't resist hanging around to watch the spectacle, his clothes reeking of gas. He was quickly arrested, but fled for the Canadian border when he was released on bail. When people generalize about protesters versus vets, I often think of guys like Joe. Okay, this is where the heading for bombing the placement center comes in. The protests at the placement center failed to dislodge the Marine recruiters, and exasperated activists came up with an ingenious response. A crowd gathered in front of the placement center, the old administration annex building, where a large sculpture of a stick of dynamite labeled TNT was erected. Today, that would have been enough for the whole thing to be shut down immediately by the cops and everyone arrested, but it was clear that this was not a bombing in progress, but another act of political theater. We gathered in a circle surrounding the bomb, and we chanted a countdown, 10, 9, 8, and so on, and at 0, the two halves of the dynamite were pulled apart to reveal a magnificent papier-mâché sculpture, brightly decorated with stars and stripes, which became known from that moment on as the Finger. This was not the politically most successful demonstration we'd ever held, but it was very satisfying. When the Evergreen printed this close-up of the finger the next week, it earned a stern rebuke from the Publications Board, one of many. The finger was a feature of several subsequent protests brought out from its place of origin, the Rosa Luxemburg Collective. Despite several years of agitation and protest, the anti-war movement was flagging by the spring of 1970. Most students were still standing aside or actually opposed to the movement. Then on April 30th, President Nixon announced he had for many months been sending bombers across the border from Vietnam into Cambodia, where he said the Viet Cong, as the administration called the Vietnamese Liberation Front, had hidden command posts. The result was a tide of bloodshed among the innocent civilians of Cambodia and a chaos which eventually enabled Pol Pot's murderous Khmer Rouge to seize power and begin their massacre of the population. Attempting to prevent toppling dominoes from spreading communism in Southeast Asia, Nixon had triggered the first falling domino himself. Stop signs in Pullman were reworked as protest signs. The country erupted in renewed protests, including the students at WSU. The most famous of these protests occurred at Kent State in Ohio, where 4 students, not all of them protesters, were shot to death by National Guardsmen. This improvised memorial appeared in a planter on the mall here, even before the identities of the Kent State victims had been determined. The war indeed seemed to have come home, but it was not the students who were leading the way. They were the enemy. Several parents were interviewed on national television saying that if their own children had been among the protesters, they would have approved of their being shot. This was probably the low point in the famous generation gap. Many young people felt that the war had been declared on them by their elders. Enraged WSU students quickly organized large protests, including a sit-in at French Administration Building and a blockage of Stadium Way at rush hour, which I showed you earlier. It was not radical union guiding events now. New coalitions quickly formed and new leaders emerged. In the fall of 1969, a remarkable young woman named Nola Cross had been made editor of the Evergreen. She became the leader of the hastily organized anti-Cambodia bombing campaign and acknowledged spokesperson for the insurgent students of WSU. She later went on to become chair of the ensuing student strike as well. She's since had a distinguished career as a labor lawyer. Shortly after the Kent State shootings, protesting black students at Jackson State College in Mississippi were fired on by police, with 12 wounded and 2 killed. This event went almost unnoticed in the wake of the intense news coverage given the shootings at Kent State. Black students here drew the conclusion that white radicals identified only with other whites and decided the time had come to press some of their urgent concerns about the racial climate on campus. They drew up a list of demands which sound similar in some ways to the Black Panther program. They called together several of us in the campus movement for a meeting at the Koinonia House, where they proposed a student strike to support their demands. This was the beginning of a unique and impressive moment in WSU history. While the rest of the country was convulsed with demonstrations and strikes against the war in Southeast Asia, WSU students and faculty launched a strike against racism. Critics like to depict the baby boomers as self-absorbed, but during this period, thousands of WSU students devoted themselves to unselfishly agitating for the rights of the small number of students of color at WSU. True, a student strike involved not going to class, and many students might have done that anyway. But thousands of them turned out for rallies and teach-ins, marched, picketed, and debated constantly for several weeks for a cause which had no obvious selfish benefits, and which indeed involved considerable culpability on their own parts, and which required them to change. The protest was directed especially against President Glenn Terrell, as had been the Cambodia bombing sit-in at French administration building shortly before. Terrell's acolytes have in the years since crafted a cozy image of him as the students' president, the friendly guy who loved to stroll across the mall and stop to chat with random students. In front of the library, which has been recently renamed for him, is a new sculpture which was inspired by his stride and is constructed of books, though he was neither a notable scholar nor particularly a supporter of the libraries. I never heard the phrase, the student's president, until decades after he left, and you'll look in vain through student publications at the time for signs of any particular affection for him. It's true, he liked to chat with random students, but most of them didn't have a clue who this old guy was who was trying to talk to them. I'll say this for him, he could have been worse. Presidents at other schools summoned troops on campus, loudly denounced protesters, and expelled students en masse. Terrell was cautious and made a great show of listening to all sides, but he irritated the hell out of a lot of faculty and students by addressing them in a simplistic, condescending tone that didn't begin to come to grips with the complexities of the issues we were raising, reminding me at least of the patronizing public speaking tone of Lyndon Johnson. Here's a photo from a faculty meeting a few years later that illustrates my own feelings about the president. When the striking students presented their demands, Terrell at first refused to meet with them, following the pattern of other college presidents and saying he would not deal with non-negotiable demands. Bob Cole and I went to see him and explained that the demands were not non-negotiable. The students wanted desperately to talk things over with him. He had been making assumptions based on what he had heard about other campuses and had very little idea what was going on among the students at WSU. He made a great show of always keeping his door open, but many of us felt that his mind was another matter. As the white students continued to strike and agitate, the black students negotiated, and some of them continued to go to class on the grounds that they could not afford to give up their educations, and the white students happily agreed to strike on their behalf. Although few of the immediate initial demands were realized, there were solid gains during this period, including the strengthening of minority studies programs, recruiting, and the establishment of a series of racism workshops, which were extremely well attended and very intense. Here's a panel at one such workshop. Here's a view of the audience crowded into Todd Auditorium. The campus YWCA became one of the leading forces in the effort, but the Black Student Union and MeChA were also important as well. This brilliant poster featuring a multiracial Uncle Sam advertised the first fall workshop following the strike. When people think of Pullman in the 60s, they often forget the strike against racism, even misremembering it as a strike against the war, like the ones that were taking place on other campuses. But to me, it marked a moment when, despite the disarray of the movement's national leadership and the increasing craziness and extremism of the left, a large number of students came together in an idealistic effort which eventually improved education at WSU in several ways. WSU didn't have the biggest demonstrations or the most violent ones, but it did produce people and events worth remembering and celebrating. Thank you. Okay, I'd be happy to take questions. right? Yes?
I was hoping you could clarify the name on some of that poster art. Was that Bill
Voiland,
Boylan?
Voiland. Yeah. Yes?
Just a comment. I've never seen this myself. There was intense conflict between the students and their parents, as you
Yes.
alluded to. It was an amazing thing. The counseling center was jammed with students trying to deal with these. They couldn't go home without getting blasted, either for their hair or they read reports about WSU or whatever. And it was very, very difficult for students.
Yeah.
It was almost like we couldn't, there was no common ground with many of these families. Just a comment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to believe now how extremely hostile a lot of parents were to their own kids. It was like they were mad at what they were seeing on TV, but the only handy person to vent their frustrations to was their own kid.
Yeah. The sexual revolution obviously was going on at the same time.
Right. It doesn't lend itself to a slideshow so well.
And that proved, oh man, that was really interesting too, because we just started teaching courses in human sexuality about that time. And the students would take their books home, and that'd be another great issue of controversy.
Yeah.
No, I taught the class. You presented some examples of faculty-student collaboration or interaction. Would you say it was pretty equal back and forth, or how, as a faculty member coming into that, were you following the student movements, or?
Yeah.
What?
It was complicated.
Yeah.
There was a faculty anti-war organization here that I actually picketed one day with them at graduation. The first year I was here, Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson, who was a Cold War Democrat, was the invited speaker. And so the anti-Vietnam faculty members decided to picket his, not picket, but leaflet his speech. And we stood outside the Coliseum, and we had these brochures denouncing him. But we were all dressed up in our best suits and ties, and the women had dresses on and everything. And it was the most warm experience of leafleting I ever had, because all these parents coming up would say, oh, well, thank you. They thought they were being given a program or something. Do you know where the parents are supposed to sit? And they wouldn't really read it until they were inside, and then by then it was too late to yell at us. So there was that kind of activity. There was a group called the Three Forks Peace Coalition, which I didn't even talk about, which was largely community people. There were some traditional pacifists, a couple of them in the philosophy department, one of them was in a picture here, Arnold Satterthwaite, who was a longtime feature on campus. And so there were all these different kinds. In SDS itself, there was an interesting thing. It was mostly young students, but then we did have the graduate students who were really the intellectual core of SDS, and those people were in their late 20s, and some of them, as I say, were vets. And then we had me. There were a few other people like Bob Cole who joined SDS but never went to meetings. And then there was Marge Perret, who is the wife of an engineering professor who used to bring, she was in her, I don't know, she must have been in her 60s at that time, and she would bring a bundle of the National Guardian, which was this really hard left-wing newspaper, to distribute at the meetings, and in the basket with them, she would have her knitting, and she would sit there and knit during the meeting. She was an absolutely charming woman, and later endowed a scholarship for women engineering students. So, you know, it was permeable. There was a lot of shifting back. Johnetta Cole, for instance, was the advisor of the Black Student Union, but she was also functioned sort of as a member of the union. And since Bob, her husband, was white and he was in the Mothers, you had these interesting flows going back and forth. the black students pretty much voluntarily segregated themselves into their own organization, but they worked with us constantly. And as I said, if they felt they needed some added support, the call would go out. And then you'd see them together in the demonstrations. So, yeah, but it was, the vast majority of the activities were inspired by students. And I didn't feel that it was my goal or my role to do things. I didn't write position papers for SDS or anything. They asked me to speak for them sometimes, but beyond that, I didn't do much. I was the main spokesman for the League for the Promotion of Militant Atheism. That was a pet project. And I did a lot with that, and of course, some of the other things I talked about. But it was basically student-led. Yeah?
Paul, would you care to comment on the polarized society of the 60s relative to the polarized political situation today, and where are the student activists today?
Yeah. I think the difference is that in the 60s, it was polarized more by generation. Today, you have people of all ages and all walks of life lining up as conservatives and liberals. And this hostility, but it's focused through the electoral system. What happened in the 60s is the electoral system seemed shut off to all access from the liberals and the radicals. They were simply booted out of the body politic. And that's what helped put the pressure kettle on that led to this explosive upsurge. And since the youth culture was already fermenting, there was a link between those two. We'll never have another period like that, I think, or at least not anytime soon, because shortly after, getting into the 70s, they learned how to market youth culture. And now, as soon as a new dance form is invented or a new magazine or anything that young people are interested in, it's going to be in Newsweek, and they're going to have a blog that everybody's reading, and the political candidates will know about it, and there's not that kind of hermetic sealing off that happened during the 60s. So what we have is, as I say, it's much more traditionally politically polarized, and in a way that's better. I mean, you actually can have votes. The student delusion that somehow they could charge into the streets and overthrow the state was ludicrous, of course, and that was always held only by a very small minority of organizers. The vast majority of students were just angry. But they also had the delusion that most people were on their side, power to the people. It's a great chant if all the people are indeed on your side. If you turn out to be in a small minority, though, it's kind of self-defeating. Anybody else?
Were there any repercussions to faculty that was involved in the student rally demonstration?
Almost all the faculty that were involved in the strike were gone within 2 years. I was one of the few that survived, and I think largely in the original longer version of this speech, I actually had John Elwood's picture up here. He was my chair, and he was a World War II veteran, but he was very much a free speech advocate, and he defended me and protected me from a lot of things, so I managed to survive, and also I was more cautious than some people. But there was a moment when, during the Cambodia thing, the history department graduate students decided to hold a teach-in on Vietnam and canceled classes for the day and invited everybody to Todd Auditorium to learn about the war instead. And when the chair of the history department got back into town and found this, he fired them all. A bunch of people lost their chance at graduate school at that point. So yeah, there was a time when I had 5 different friends in jail. People often wonder, why did the movement tail off at the end? Well, yes, it was somewhat peak of frustration on the part of young people losing their energies and stuff. But there was a relentless pounding on the movement at the time, infiltration by FBI agents trying to provoke problems, and lots of arrests and a lot of hassles that also led to a lot of putting on the brakes. Yes?
When will that be in the library? My daughter...
It's there now.
It's there now?
Yeah. I turned it in. It's just called Images of the Counterculture WSU in the 60s. If you ask Trevor Bond, the first person I credited up here, about it, he knows where all those things are. Sigvold has now donated his archives, including those posters that I showed you, and a lot of magazines and newspapers. Most of this material either came from the Daily Evergreens archives from the yearbook during that period, or from Sigvold's stuff, or what's in the archives. Manuscripts, Archives, and Special Collections is developing a wonderful collection for studying Pullman in the 60s. And it's really pretty impressive.
I got here in '71, and just at the tail end of all this, and I tried to explain it to my daughter, who's here now. She would have come with me to see it, but she was in the marching band. So I really wanted her to see it because she has this idea of, she thinks I was this hippie. I went and watched everything, but I didn't participate.
Right.
She thinks, she just has this out of proportion idea of what happened, and this would be perfect.
Well, what they've got over there is a PDF that includes all the pictures embedded with the text. So that, and they're going to print it out so you can look at it, and you can. And we're hoping to mount the PDF on the website so that people can download it and use it as a research source. Yeah.
Would you agree that there was a lot of hypocrisy regarding the administration during these years? Let me give you one example from my own perspective. The Dean of Schools was getting out the party line that we have a lot of sympathy for you students and all those things. But on the slide, he formed a drug control unit, which composed of 4 young police officers from Seattle, so nobody knew them. And they just circulated out, and the marijuana was big, everything was marijuana. And so they circulated around campuses and got into the parties and then started arresting especially the dealers, but the users as well. And some of our best students in the psych building, in our psych department, were getting nailed. And at that time, I was on the university conduct committee, and we got these parade of students coming in with the offense of marijuana. And we all resigned because we said this is ridiculous. You're destroying careers, destroying. But the administration, I felt, was unbelievably hypocritical.
Yeah, they're very skillful on saying the right thing to different audiences and sort of going in the middle. But like I said, you've got to contrast that with how they behaved on some other campuses where it was open war on the students. They were sneaky. One of the things that happened during that very period you're talking about that I personally knew was that there was this young woman who was a notorious pothead. She was just always stoned, and she got busted, and the cops told her that they would not sentence her, not try her, if she would turn in other students. So she went around and told all her friends that she was getting married, and they were going to have a big party, and she needed enough drugs in order to have this party. And she whined and bothered them. She was not a very popular person, but at length a few people grudgingly said, okay, go away already, and gave her some drugs, and they were all busted as dealers. So, I mean, I wrote a letter to the Lewiston Tribune, which was printed anonymously, explaining that story, and because I didn't want to get dragged into the net myself, although I was not a drug user. But, yeah, that's the kind of thing that went on. Yeah.
I was right in the middle of a lot of this, only I tended to be on the other side. I was one of, I think, the majority of the faculty that thought things could be done through normal channels, and we were wrong. But I think the administration would have been even harsher on students if the students had gone out of their way not to give them an excuse. Just for instance, there were a bunch of students marching through Sloan Hall one day, waving banners and chanting and so forth. At noon hour, the bell rang for classes to start. Absolute silence in there. Administration building, they were waiting there trying to talk to Terrell. And Terrell was conveniently in Seattle, or at least said he was. And they were there late into the night, and they were even there eating and drinking pop and so forth. When they decided nothing good was going to happen, they left, but a bunch of them stayed and cleaned up all the trash, washed the windows. They were the most polite demonstrators I've ever seen. And I think if they'd been a little bit harsher with their means, the administration would have shown even more their lack of understanding of what was going on.
Yeah, I think both sides showed remarkable restraint compared to a lot of places. There's one incident that happened during this period that you can read about in some books that I haven't mentioned, and I didn't show a picture of, because it really wasn't a part of all of this, and that was the burning of the stadium. Who burned the stadium, of course. There was a black student on campus, and I won't name him, but he was rather flamboyant, and he decided that it would be cool and interesting to go over under the charred timbers and hold up his cigarette lighter and taunt the police. And they immediately arrested him for burning the stadium. Now, anybody with half a brain could have figured out that he didn't burn down the stadium, and a lot of us knew who burned the stadium. But it was just a guy who was stoned, and he wanted to see some really pretty flames. And that's what he told Stimson when he wrote his book, and he actually put that in, which I thought was much to his credit. Stimson was a very conservative guy, staff here, but Sigvold and I and several other people talked to him. He did a good job of recording what we had to say, but it was mostly from the point of view of the administration. But I thought he did a fair job. It's a good chapter in his book. Yeah?
You talked about at least the Burgerville Blues being sort of forcibly put into publication.
Yeah.
What did you see as far as the divide with the rest of the publication?
Well, usually the early ones were mimeographed, but that was kind of very difficult and messy, and it didn't make much of a nice looking product. But what would happen is you'd get, say, the Idahoan in Moscow to print you for a little while, and then the advertisers would come in and say, we're going to pull our ads out of your paper if you keep printing this rag for these radical students. And then the paper would say, sorry, we're not doing it anymore. So that's what would always shut down these publications. And that's why they needed to buy their own press. And it worked really well for about 5 issues until Seattle type swooped down. I always thought that was much more memorable than the Cup of the East-West conflict. So I was at that meeting in what was then the Common Ministries sort of residential center, and we sat around this rug. We knew that they were coming, and that they were telling us they were coming to get our press, and sitting trying to decide what to do. And that was a pretty sorry evening, I think. Yes?
Why do you think in that time period people saw it as part, or students at least, saw it as part of their civic duty to make change? Whereas now it seems to be like, hey, nobody gives a damn.
Well, it wasn't so much that they saw it as a civic duty to make changes. They felt they already had changed, that they were different from their parents. They liked different music. They had different ideas about freedom. They liked to read different things. They liked different movies. Their whole culture was different from that of their others. And so they felt alienated already. And so what they were pushing for was the right to implement their vision of the world on a larger scale. And they were coming up against conflict. You don't have that head-on antipathy now. You got a lot of 40 and 50-year-olds running around trying to look like 20-year-olds. I mean, there's been quite a few articles about, you know, older women burying their midriffs, for instance, recently. That kind of thing. So it would be exaggerating to say that all students were idealistic during the period, but some were. It was an era that fostered a sense of maybe there's something you could do to change the world. It could be part of the change. And I haven't mentioned it because it's not really part of this talk about WSU, but there had been big student uprisings in Europe and in Japan and in Latin America, in Mexico City, very famous one where students were fired on and killed in '68. And so the American students, to some extent, were emulating that, and they felt themselves to be part of a worldwide student uprising that was going to transform civilization. It did, but it had some lasting effects. But it seemed at the time more of a coherent phenomenon than it turned out to be. Anybody else?
Where was the University of Idaho? Did they do anything?
Some. It's interesting. The University of Idaho, like I said, was much more conservative than WSU. And they tended to come along much more slowly. But what happened is that WSU has this revolving door thing going, where people come here, they stay a little while, and then they leave. Now, there's a number of you sitting out in the audience who've been here as long as I have, and longer. But
as far as students are concerned, they don't tend to hang around. And over there, the school is much smaller in proportion to the population. And there was a certain number who opened up businesses, settled down, and made a core of liberal and radical and alternative thought that made Moscow the granola center of the local universe. And Pullman got emptied out of all those lively student spirits and replaced by a new generation who are interested in making money. And so you have much more rapid transformation here, sliding away from the movement, and in Moscow, much more of a continuation of the same ideas. So, yeah, although Moscow, U of I made one mistake. They formed a free university too, but they got a big grant to fund it, and they paid people. Well, immediately what happened is everybody descended on this pile of money wanting to get their share of it, and it collapsed in short order. We never paid anybody. We were broke, and we weren't worth taking over or fighting over because there was nothing to steal. So we lasted for 30 years. Well, I think you probably want to get out and see what our delightful weather is. So I'll be happy to stick around and talk with any of you if you will. Thank you all for coming.